Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff I Never Told You, a production of iHeartRadio. And welcome to another happy hour. As always, drink responsibly if you choose to do so. We just hope for these to be kind of moments for you to take in your day, hang out with us, have some conversations. What are you sipping on, Samantha?
Oh, I went back to my trusty Hot and Stormy.
Yes.
Yeah, which is essentially dark and stormy with jalapenos that I shake up in there.
It's delicious. It's delicious. Love it. I'm jealous. I am currently out of liquor, so I am just on the boxed red wine. And it's nice.
Red wine.
It happens every time.
I have to. I'm sorry.
No, it's in your contract. I know.
It's true.
So this one, I teased this one in the last one that we did. This one's a bit of an unhappy hour, but I don't think it's going to be that sad. It is storming outside, so it's like perfect for this conversation. I like you've got the hot and stormy. I've got my red wine. I feel like we're setting the scene. It's appropriate. But before we get into the meat of what I want to talk about, we do have something we want to follow up with on the last happy hour that I did that was about kind of how we view villains, the gender differences in villains. And I was making the point that in our media at large, I feel like we give a lot more space to forgive and explain male, generally white male trauma. And both of us had follow-up thoughts.
Yeah.
So we want to include it in here. So Samantha, what you were telling me about a show that has a bit of a different take, a different vibe going on.
So one of the shows that I love dearly and is now on my repeat list with Supernatural, New Girl, Parks and Rec is Once Upon a Time or Once, which is a Disney ABC show. I think they've got new pickups. And I know people know it. People love it. It was the same creators that did Lost. So it was a whole different look. But essentially it is fairy tales that come into the reality, today's world, and what does that look like. But for those of you who may have seen it, it has Snow White, the Evil Queen, Prince Charming, and of course, a spell, like all the dark stuff. You have characters like Rapunzel, you have Rumpelstiltskin, you have all of those characters as a part of it. You'll see Mulan. Eventually, Elsa comes through. Yes, all of them come through.
Wow.
Wicked Witch of the East come through, like so many things. So Wizard of Oz is in there, Peter Pan, all of that. But the biggest villain in the first two seasons is Regina, who is the evil queen to Snow White. And her origin story is much different other than just, being jealous of Snow White's beauty. But she ends up having a redemption arc at the beginning of the second season. Into the first season, you don't see the redemption arc, except for that she does feel love for someone and willing to sacrifice for someone. And then it turns into her becoming the hero, as they say. Literal plot is villain versus hero. And she's trying to get her story rewritten to be a hero because she can't have a happy ending until she does.
Oh.
But within the entire show, you have all of that. So Selena, who plays her sister, is a villain. And then she gets a redemption arc because she does live. Elsa and Anna are featured with Hans and all of them. But they bring in the Snow Queen, who is a villain, who also gets a redemption arc. But she does die. Like you said when we were off the mic, a lot of the redemption arc is that they don't survive to actually, but her happy ending is going with her sisters who had died. So she gets to be with her sisters essentially. But yeah, it has the entirety of the thing, but it kind of does the ebb and flow of redemption. And a lot of them are women.
That's interesting. I'll have to check that out. I know you've told me about that. And it has Sebastian Stan in it, right?
Yes, which by the way,
yeah, we're
going to talk about this later on a different episode, but he plays his creepy character in this. And I was like, oh yeah, he does. And I need you to watch that episode.
Oh, Lord. All right. We'll do an exchange because I'm making you watch the Mark Hamill episode of What We Do in the Shadows. I'll watch that. It's going to be great.
Okay. We got this.
I hope that's a fair exchange. I think it is. Perfect. One thing that I forgot to mention, like you said, is that the redemption arc, I kept using that term when we were talking about male villains. And the examples I gave were, I gave a lot, but 3 of them, like Kylo Ren, Darth Vader, Severus Snape, they do have these redemption arcs. And in some ways, you could even argue, like, if the main theme of like whatever property they're in is their redemption arc, or one of the main themes anyway. And redemption is almost like not the correct term, because what happens is they die before they're redeemed, and then they die before they do any of the work of possible redemption. Because, you know, if you've done these terrible things, I'm not saying you shouldn't try to fix isn't even the right word, but try to be better and try to do what you can to help. But like, as we've said a lot, forgiveness is not up to you. It's up to the person who you've wronged. So doing that hard work of trying to be better, they never show that part. They just are like, oh, they're good now. Goodbye, they're dead. And like Severus Snape is a little different because you kind of get this like flashback thing where you're like, oh, he's been doing this. But still, you don't really see it.
Right.
It's sort of like mentioned like, oh yeah, he has been doing this stuff behind the scenes of trying to save Harry. But he was doing it, I mean, not to dismiss it entirely, but he was doing it for very selfish reasons. So that's a point I meant to make and forgot to make. And I do think that's important because it's kind of like we see all of the terrible stuff they do, and then they do one thing where you're like, oh, okay. And then they die.
Which is why I think I do like Once Upon a Time. There's a lot of it. It's like, it's continual miscommunication all the time and back and forth. And it does try to contrive on the idea that there's no just plain good and evil. People have the mix. But the fact that Regina's story of trying to become a hero or good lasts pretty much the entirety until the last season, which that was like a big turn. And I just recently watched it because I hadn't seen that part, but it jumps the shark where the main young character who starts all of this is like an adult, and he has his turn to do all of the work. Which, by the way, in that as well, in the last season, they have a new version of Cinderella, and the wicked stepmother, who is the villain, also has a redemption arc. Oh. So there's a lot of women, evil women, that kind of has a different conversation, different turn. I'm sure there's a lot of problematic things that I've not noticed that are like, what? But the heroes and the heroines are typically all women with some back characters. So I do appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's good to know, because I did research this and people had a lot of examples, but a lot of it was stuff that I kind of had to take their word for it because I hadn't seen whatever thing they were talking about. So in my own experience, I do agree that generally we're way more forgiving of male characters than female characters, especially villains. But I'm happy to know that that exists.
Yeah. And I know there's a big fan base for Once Upon a Time, which is why it lasted as long as it did. And people love Regina, her character.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I mean, I said, like, I love Hela. I get the critiques against her, but I love Hela. And there's been plenty of women who are villains that I have loved. I
believe her name is Lana Parrilla. I'm so sorry if I'm saying this wrong. But people love her. Like her, because she does evil. She has this deep, gravelly voice. And when she has that smirk, I don't know if anybody could play this character better than her. Like, she does an amazing job. And of course, we have Jennifer Morrison, who used to be on House and, you know, pretty famous, as well as Jennifer Goodwin and Josh Dallas, who was in the first Thor movie as the blonde friend. I can't remember the name. Yeah. There you go. The way I like to, you know, cross-reference my shows and movies.
I love it. I love it. I often think of you whenever someone's like, it's this person from there. I'm like, yes, Samantha. Okay, so I'm glad we had that update. So this whole idea that I want to talk about, I'm not going to go into it too in depth, is something that kind of came to fruition because I've had a lot of family drama recently, and I just got it in my head that, like, what if I'm the problem here? Like, what if I've been looking at this the entire incorrect way, and in instances where I'm trying to help, maybe I've been hurting. And it's that whole, like, from a certain point of view, Obi-Wan Kenobi nonsense. I get what you're saying, man, but geez. And I was thinking about it, and so one of the traits, particularly in question, is I am someone who I feel I struggle with expressing negative emotions, even when it would be healthy to do so. And because of that, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and I believe I've talked about it before, but one of them is I feel like women are generally socialized to not be negative, to kind of be these like positive, life of the party socializers. I'm going to make sure everything's fine, and move on. And with some things that have recently happened, I just started getting in my head of like, what if that did so much more damage than I ever realized when I thought I was trying to help? And then, then you go down to like, well, I've been raised to be this way, and how many other women feel this way? And then, like, what if the other version of the events that people in my orbit are telling is that I'm the villain of this story? And then I got all in my head of like, that makes sense to a certain extent. If you have friends, they are going to be on your side if they're good friends, unless you did something really terrible, and then they should rightfully call you out. So there's a part of me that's like gets it, but then there's also a part of me that has that sort of trained women have to be liked unless you're a terrible person, and then I don't care. But like, I have to be liked, and I have to do what's right, and I have to all these things. And we talked about that in the episode we did on villains and heroes, is that, the story of the hero is that they're selfless, which is fine, but it has been weaponized against women, which we've talked about in past book clubs and stuff. And then I just started thinking about how that could look to other people and how that could impact other people. So I don't know, I've always tried to do, like, make people happy. And I thought that was a good thing, but maybe it wasn't. And I'm doing some real self-reflection on it lately.
I think we did talk about the fact that I said, you're the Bruno of Encanto, meaning the mystery that really made no sense that he was ostracized or blamed. It really didn't make any sense other than he was just there. But they all wanted to place this blame on him for no reason. And of course, and then as we've grown up and come back and reflect, people are like, wait, you're right. You're not the problem. We're so sorry. We just needed to blame something. And I'm saying this as in like not knowing much, not just knowing the bits about your life, but like sitting with you and kind of going through it. And like, wow, for me as someone who you're more likely to make it sound worse than it is. As where some people fluff it up to try to not sound as bad. So I'm like, it doesn't make sense. But essentially it's like, it just happened to be you were there. And it became a focal point. And also kind of like a lot of these stories that I get so frustrated by, but they are miscommunicating. And so because they're secrets or things that they can't be unfolded, that's things that can't be said, assumptions are made, and it becomes pretty big plot line / tragic in the overall, because what you're doing is trying to protect others, which is what happens in these stories as well. And it's like, if you could only, but of course it's not that simple.
Right.
It's never that simple. But that's that character too of like, it follows suit in that I'm trying to protect. By me protecting myself, I get hurt and get caught in the crossfire, and there's nothing I can do because you're afraid of the results of being honest, which is a whole different conversation. But yeah, it becomes that origin story.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, that is a good point, because definitely in examining this, it is kind of a tragedy of everybody trying to protect everybody else. And it just escalated in a terrible way. But I also have a lot of fears that I do think are very sexist in nature, that like I'm afraid that people won't believe me when I tell them things. And I've been called out for stuff. And it's like I literally shut down and I'm like, I don't know how to prove this to you, but it happened to me. Like I don't. Mm-hmm. And then I get all in my head about like, what if my brain is messed up and I'm misremembering things and you're remembering it correctly, and like all the intricacies of memory. And that freaks me out. But also, I feel like women and marginalized people in general are much more likely to just kind of turn the blame on themselves. Like, I should have done better, I should have done more. And so that's a part of it too, where it's become very like, I'm trying to get better, but it's become a very negative thing of like all my failures, like a list of like, oh, you're right, I did screw this up and this up and this up and this up. And a lot of this happened when I was a kid. And it's culminated, but I think that is part of it too. And it just, I don't know, sometimes something reaches a point where it's so hard to go back and talk about it. Because you've just sort of, part of your survival is we don't talk about this.
Right. You don't talk about Bruno.
You don't talk about Bruno. But I don't know, I imagine a lot of people who have gone through trauma can connect to this some way. I mean, we even talk about it with victim blaming. It's kind of related to that of like you turning it in on yourself, and then all of the kind of ripples and how it impacts people who weren't at the like center of whatever trauma. You can feel guilt for that you brought it up or that you talked about it or anything.
Right. I mean, it doesn't help when you do have people in your life that you feel like you can't share because they're not ready to hear it, quote unquote. I think I told the story about I literally got shut down because I was talking about work and my work was not pretty. But I was kind of happy and literally got chastised because I made someone who has never felt that way before feel bad. And again, yes, the Debbie Downer content, I get it. It's not necessarily nice and you don't want to hear that all the time. And I did have to like absolutely filter myself, but people would ask me, how are you? And then they would ask questions, and I'm not good at fake. I'm good. How are you? I'm not good.
Right.
I don't like that from people. So I don't give that either. But they were also close friends of mine. And it just was like, I think at one point we were talking about abuse and my abuse that I'd gone through, and the fact that I got mad that she had shut me down and her husband had shut me down, and it was just a little like, Samantha, really? I got shut down that way. And someone making an excuse, trying to be good friends to both of us, were like, but so-and-so really can't deal with that. Stuff like that bothers them. Yeah. She can't handle things like that.
Yeah.
In which my response is, who the thinks that it can?
Right.
Like, I was so angry. I was in that angry tears.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, you know what? If you would have asked me before that happened to me, could I have handled it? No.
Right. Yeah.
No one gets up in the morning and say, man, I could handle that. I can handle assault or violence. Sure, let's go. And I'm like, that's so unfair. Yeah. And if I'm trusting you as my friend and you shut me down, you're not my friend.
Yeah.
But because we've learned these lessons, we have become very guarded at who we trust.
Right. And I think that's part of all this stuff that I'm trying to untangle, is because, we've been very open about this stuff, but a lot of the trauma I experienced happened when I was a kid. And I like look back, and there are certain things that I did and said that I hate that I did and said, because I didn't understand. I was a kid. I didn't understand all these adult issues around like addiction or whatever it was. And I did shut down and I did become very closed off, especially around like any men, any boys, and kind of combative. But I was a kid. So it's like finding that forgiveness for yourself where like, yes, I regret those things. I wish I hadn't done it, but I was a kid.
Right.
I didn't know.
And also who was there to protect us and there wasn't. And that should be the bigger conversation is that, yes, we have regret as a kid. There's things that I wish I'd never said. There are things that I wish that wasn't done. This was my coping and I didn't know what else to do. And instead of people seeing that I needed help, they blamed me.
Yeah.
And I know as people with trauma and childhood trauma know that conversation.
Yes.
And that's the bigger, and that was trauma on top of trauma. Right.
That's the laying awake at night and just turning these things over and over again in your head and thinking, why couldn't I have done something different? But you were 14 at the time or whatever it is.
Right.
I don't know. I think as I've said before, I think I said it in the very first happy hour I did on the cinnamon roll. I think it was always really important to me to believe I could be as silly as it sounds, the hero of the story. So this was pretty I'm glad I'm thinking about it. I don't think it's bad, but it was sort of a setback.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, and I think those conversations are important to have about what we hold up as heroic and what we villainize. But yeah, that's just something that's been on my mind. I'm sure I'll have more thoughts. I love talking about heroes and villains and all tropes therein.
Well, I'm going to need you to watch Once Upon a Time so we can talk about some of these characters in your Women Around the World.
Oh, okay. I'm into it. How many seasons? How big of an endeavor am I looking at?
I think there's 7 seasons.
All right. So an endeavor. But all right. Okay.
You can pick and choose, and I can help you out.
You should do what I did for you with Clone Wars. Send me the hits.
A list?
Yeah.
All the first season. And then after we can go. Because that brings the foundation.
All right. I'm into it. And all I ask and request is watch Star Wars with me all the time. And Mark Hamill and What We Do in the Shadows.
Which I've already started. Come on.
Yes.
And Screams. And
I'm a terrible entertainment.
And Fresh. And not at all. You're not terrible.
It's my love language.
I'm ready. I love it.
Perfect. Well, cheers.
Cheers.
Yes. Thanks to everyone for joining us. As always, if you have any suggestions, anything you'd like for us to talk about, pontificate on, you can send them to us. Yes, our email is stuffmediamomstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can find us on Twitter at MomStuffPodcast or on Instagram at Stuff I've Never Told You. Thanks, as always, to our super producer, Christina.
Also a hero, obviously.
Oh, a hero. And thanks to you for listening. Stuff I've Never Told You is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.